Hi Janeites, and welcome back to the What the Austen podcast. I have a really special guest lined up today. I am joined by Caroline Jane Knight, who is Jane Austen's fifth great niece and the last of Jane Austen's nieces to live at Chawton House. Caroline published her memoir Jane and Me back in 2017, and after reading it, I thought she'd just be a fantastic person to have on the podcast to discuss what it was like growing up at Chawton House, what it's like being related to Jane Austen, and her journey to start the Jane Austen Literacy Foundation, which is a not-for-profit organisation run entirely by volunteers, and their focus is to support literacy projects in developing communities and also connect people all over the world who believe in the power of literacy. So an incredible organisation, and I'm really excited to get into this episode. So hi Caroline, it's so fantastic to have you on the podcast with me.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. So I am going to ask you the question that I ask all my guests. I know it might sound slightly redundant coming to you, but what got you into Jane Austen originally?
Well, my first, I don't sort of have a first memory of Jane, as it were, because I came home from the hospital as a baby in my parents' arms to Chawton House. So, and obviously that's, Chawton House was owned by Jane's brother. And she spent the last 8 years of her life living in a cottage, which was part of her brother's estate at that time, Chawton Cottage. So, and Chawton House, obviously Jane Austen, now she's an absolute megastar, isn't she? Absolute megastar. But even in the 70s and 80s, when I was growing up at Chawton House, that was pre-Colin Firth. And believe me, the world of Jane Austen was different before that 95 production and the Sense and Sensibility, obviously, that happened that same year. But Jane Austen was, of course, Jane Austen has been famous and hugely so and hugely loved for centuries. So even when I was a child, there were, thousands of visitors every year coming to Chawton. Our house was open during the summer because we welcomed people in, because Granny actually ran a tea room from the Great Hall at the front of Chawton House, which I earned my pocket money in. But even as the youngest child, I can remember, the names Lizzie and Darcy. I remember that a lot of the visitors that came in, of course, that's, those were the names that I was hit with, I was hearing. And I remember, and I'm honestly going to say 4 or 5 years old, I think this memory is. I remember that I used to proudly say, yes, Jane Austen was a pioneer. And I was so proud. And I think the reason it really sticks in my mind is because I actually at that age had no idea what a pioneer was. I actually didn't know what I was saying. I'd heard someone else say it. Do you know what I mean? And it sounded so grand. And I'd sort of, I think I'd heard the word obviously used in the context of grand, and hugely accomplished people, and people who had invented things and done amazing things. Pioneer is a word that's used with, notable people, isn't it? So I remember that I'd latched onto that word. And as I said, with any Jane Austen fans, tourists, whatever that I'd meet, as I said, that would either be in the tea room, or we also hosted every summer, so every July, the Jane Austen Society of the UK, their annual AGM was at Chawton House every year. So for a day in July, we'd have 500 or 600 people there that had come from America and all over the world to come to this AGM. And as I said, all I remember is absolutely, Jane Austen was a pioneer and just how proud I was, but hoped that no one would ask me any more questions because I didn't really know what I was saying. That's the thing.
Yeah. I suppose that's the thing. You would be considered like the natural kind of like historian on Jane Austen just because you're related to her. So I would also have that fear. I'd be like, please don't ask me questions.
And that's something that, to be honest, has always been a challenge, because of course I can hold my own in Jane Austen, if you know what I mean. I can talk about Jane Austen very, of course I know Jane. I have my version of Jane, but of course I know a lot about her and her work. But I'm not an academic. I haven't studied Jane in the way that an academic would. And yet people absolutely would have the assumption that as her family, particularly having grown up in Chawton, that we would actually be at the top of that, knowledge tree, as it were. And that's not true.
Or even know all the secrets.
Exactly. And oh my goodness, if only we did have the missing secret diary, then that would be, what a fight that would be, but unfortunately we don't. So yes.
No, absolutely. And I love that. And something that really stood out in your book to me was the significance of family. I had no idea how many members of your family were living in Chawton at the same time as you were, and obviously with your gran. And I love the stories that you wrote about her and working in the tea room, which I actually found so relatable because my first job was actually in the estate across the road in the tea room.
Yeah.
So it was just nice to, like, you know, I was like, I was able to imagine it in such a great way. But it'd be amazing to tell the listeners kind of what it was like living there with all your family members living there as well, and how that layout worked.
Yep.
Yeah.
So we had, I mean, Chawton House, a big house, and of course, originally was designed to have. I mean, it was actually built back in 1585. The build started by John Knight, and of course, my name's Knight, so I grew up believing that John Knight was my 15th great grandfather. And in actual fact, that's not true. And it's not true because in the 16 generations of squires there have been, and the house has never been sold. It's been passed down through generation to generation. And my uncle Richard still owns the freehold today. But in truth, of those 16 steps, on 8 occasions, the squire hasn't had any children. Because, of course, there wasn't the fertility treatment, you know, there was actually been, as I said, 50% of the time, there actually hasn't been an heir. So in that circumstance, what happened was that somebody was chosen as the heir. And it might be usually male, obviously, a male cousin or, you know, nephew or something like that. And that actually means that, of course, that the house, whilst it's being passed down, and you can inherit it on the condition that your name is changed to Knight. So that actually means that, as I said, different branches of the family have sort of come in. And that's actually how come the Austins ended up, you know, connected to Chawton House, because the Austins and the Knights were fourth cousins. Thomas and Catherine Knight at the end of the 18th century realised they weren't going to have children. They needed an heir. They knew the Austins well, and they thought that Edward Austen, Jane's older brother, was made of the right stuff. You know, you're appointing the next CEO of the family business is what you're doing in kind of today's terms. And by all accounts, Edward was a very, very good squire of Chawton, and he was a good pick. But that meant that, you know, all of the Knight estates, which was Chawton and Steventon and Godmersham Park at that stage, all went to Edward on the condition he changed his name. So he changed from Edward Austen to Edward Knight, which is why we're Knights and not Austins, because Edward is my fourth great grandfather. That's where the line sort of comes in. Obviously, Jane had no children of her own. So that's how come the properties ended up with the Austins, and then Jane obviously had the opportunity in 1809 with her mother and sister Martha Lloyd to move to Chawton, to the cottage, and that's where she sat down in earnest to write. Now, we of course all know that Jane died relatively young, but the rest of the family didn't, and everybody else just stayed in Chawton. And Chawton House was actually just continued to be passed down through the line, and I'm just incredibly lucky. I really am. That I am, as I said, I'm part of that direct line. And then when I was born, my grandfather, who was Edward Knight III, was the squire and owned it. And we were lucky enough to live there. In practice, when we lived there, the house was sort of split into separate sections, if you like. So, and because originally there would have been a big house kitchen, which in modern terms, you can't cook in one of those big old kitchens that the houses like that had. That's not how modern kitchens work. So in practice, me and my family lived in the north wing, on different floors of the north wing. And in one of the rooms, which used to be the billiard room, a kitchen was installed in there. And in a room upstairs that had once been a dressing room or a small bedroom, a bathroom was put up there. So bathrooms and kitchens were sort of installed in different parts of the house. So we had the north wing. My grandparents had what you would have called we were above stairs, i.e. it was all oak panelled and glorious, if you know what I mean. It was all beautiful. My grandparents had, I suppose, the main part of the house. So they had the library and the grand bedroom chambers and the great hall and the study. And, you know, they had that part of the house, which was over a few floors. And then my cousins had the entire top floor of the house, is sort of how it worked. And again, with kitchens and bathrooms sort of installed. It was I growing up at Chawton House was incredible. I mean, what an incredible place to be. And anyone that's been there will know what a special place it is and what the atmosphere is like there. And you can just imagine Jane there. I mean, it's so Austen-esque in its sort of feeling. It is to me anyway. So our lives were a mixture of total normality, because one part of this story that I haven't said yet, is that whilst we still lived in this incredible house, all of the money had run out decades before. So we had the house, but in truth it was crumbling. I couldn't see that as a
Yep.
child. You don't see that. And oak paneling doesn't look like that. But, scratch the, so, and it needed a new roof and it needed things doing to it. Both of my parents, I said there was no, but in many ways we were just like any other family. Both of my parents worked. It was a constant, as in most families it is, a constant juggle of managing the finances and making sure that bills can be paid, and the bills in that house were really expensive.
As most old houses are. Yeah.
Absolutely. I went to the local school like everybody else. In a way, life was completely and utterly normal, the same as everybody else had it. But we were living in what was partly home, but also partly venue, if you like, because there were sort of 6 to 8 big events that would be held at the house every year. The village fete was there every year, the horticultural show was there every year, the Jane Austen Society of AGM was there every year, the tea room was open all summer, so it was always a busy working sort of house. And I think in retrospect, the tea room must have been for income. It must have been for my grandparents. I'm assuming that's why Granny did it. And as I said, so it was, but as a kid who loves cooking, and I love getting involved in organising things and all that sort of thing, it was fantastic. And I was always busy, and there was always the next thing to bake with Granny for, or there was always the next event that we were sort of talking about. And in between all of that, we had our sort of all of our family events there, and all of the, so I'd say at least on average, at least once a month, there was something that was going to happen at the house that was quite major that we'd be getting ready for. And I loved that.
Yeah.
I mean, the feeling of being part of something, if you know what I mean. We were the knights from Chawton House, and I was really proud of that. Really proud of knowing where I came from and having such a strong connection. And of course,
and such a centre of community as well. Like it just sounds like the community just gravitated because that was like the house, especially in Chawton as well.
And that's what I mean. Back in Edward's
it's always
time,
been.
That's what it had been exactly. That in that time, the entire village obviously would have worked on the estate, and it was part of the squire's, duty was to throw those occasions for the village, and to obviously an opportunity for everyone to get together and to say thank you to everybody. So yes, I mean, obviously for me, it was completely normal. All of that was completely normal. But as I said, it was, and I mean, I suppose the other thing that was notable about it is, of course, when you grow up where 17 generations of your family have been before I'm 17th generation, every single thing that you can see, one of your ancestors has put it there. Their portraits all over the walls. Every tree's been planted by somebody. Every rooms are all sort of marked with different people's initials in the wood paneling, beautifully carved, and all these different things. And the sense of belonging that gives you, is really strong, if you know what I mean. And I haven't lived in Chawton House for at least 35 years. But it is so part of me, I mean, I can't, and it's not actually the bricks and mortar. That's not what it is. It's, it's that place is where I come from. And that's where,
that sense of belonging.
Very strong.
It's almost part of your DNA. Yeah.
Absolutely it is. Absolutely it is. It is. Yeah, indeed.
Yeah. And I'd love to touch on that a little bit more later on when we talk about obviously what it was like to leave. But considering you were talking about Jane Austen, how you saw her as a pioneer, something that stood out in your book as well is how many women pioneers you had in your family. Like your gran, for instance, seemed like such an amazing woman. Your mum was such a promoter for education for women. So yeah, I'd really love to just to chat a little bit about that.
Yeah, so Granny, as you said, I mean, if you read the history books, of course, all the obituaries, if you like, of note in the family, are the men, aren't they? It's the men that are the squires, and it's the men that hold the titles, and it's the men that do all of that. But in practice, of course, the women are also playing an extremely important role of what's going on. And in practice, it's often the women that are actually running the show, behind the scenes, as it were. And certainly that's how it felt in between my grandparents. My grandfather, Edward Knight III, we obviously didn't call him that. We called him Bapops. That was his nickname from the family. But he was reclusive. By the time I was born, he was very reclusive and spent most of his time, in the house, sitting in the library. And I actually didn't, and this is something that I think really sort of is just a marker of how different the culture was. Because my grandfather, who I spent 17 years living with, never spoke to me. We never had a conversation in all of that time. And except for on his deathbed, which obviously I write about in the book, what that sort of conversation was and what that was like. So he was very reclusive, didn't talk to me and lots of other people too. He just was, as I said, a very reclusive man. So my grandmother was the one that was absolute front and centre. If there were tradespeople there, she was dealing with them. If she ran the tea room, she made sure that he was looked after. She dealt with, anything that had to be dealt with, it was Granny doing it. And she was, to me, she was an incredibly loving granny, and I spent a lot of time cooking with her, organising things with her, and I learnt a lot from her. I mean, that sort of, I definitely picked up a lot from her. I think to other people, she could have, and I'm saying this obviously in an amusing way, I love her very dearly, but she could have a touch of the Catherine de Bourghs, just in the sense of the level of confidence with which she spoke. I mean, obviously Catherine de Bourgh says ridiculous things, and Granny didn't do that. But I just mean that air of utter authority. And, even the most sort of, cheekiest of friend we might have had, if you know what I mean, wouldn't, not in front of Granny. Nobody would ever, And so if Granny said something, I didn't question it. She was just a woman of absolute certainty. And in the tea room, which now, I mean, when I look back, I just think it's hilarious. In the tea room, she had this funny idea, because she used to make all the cakes. And nowadays, it's obviously all about having all the individual cakes and things. It wasn't back then. She made, there'd be a big chocolate sponge, a big coffee cake, a big Victoria sponge, and obviously slices were cut and put on plates for people that were buying tea and cake. She had this, for some reason, and this is what I think it was. I think it was because it was in her mind, these were people coming into her house and having tea. And in her mind, they didn't get to choose what cake they were going to have. So if you ordered tea and cake, you were not allowed to say, "Can I have a piece of coffee cake?" No, you will get whichever piece of cake you get given. And to the point where sometimes people would say, "Can I choose my cake?" And I'd know she was sort of out hovering, and I'd sort of go, "Give it a minute, you know what I mean?" And wait till she'd sort of left the room.
I'll sneak you the cake.
To say, which one do you want? I don't know why she. As I said, the only thing it sort of felt like is because, as I said, and obviously we're talking a long time ago, and I don't mean the concept of customer service was different in the way that, of course, customers were really important, and she was incredibly polite to people and things, but she just had some very firm ideas about things, and she wasn't going to be. And I never asked her why. I wouldn't have dared ask her why. But as I said, I don't want to come across like she was scary. To me, she wasn't at all. She was just a very self-assured woman. She was the mistress of Chawton House, is who she was. And she literally was, and she embodied that. My mother's background is very, very different. Mum was actually born in England, but came over to Australia when she was a couple of years old, and settled in South Australia. So actually spent her childhood here in Australia. And when my dad was about 18, I think, he came out to Australia from England and ended up working on a sheep station up in mid-north South Australia, not far from where my mum lived. And they actually met at a country dance there. Subsequently ended up going back.
How very Austen.
Isn't it? Absolutely. And I certainly know that I don't think my mother really. I mean, I think Dad had a crumpled photograph of Chawton House in his pocket, but that was about it. She actually didn't really kind of understand or comprehend, necessarily what she was, what she was getting into. But they, so they actually got married in Australia. They had my brother here, and then went back to England. But my mother, the thing I have to say that I really, really admire about my mother, and it's very interesting having sort of a family, again, that has two different cultures in it, as a lot of ours do. A lot of our families, a lot of people have, obviously, families that blend two, different cultures. But my mother has, that absolute spirit of I'm going to say something very Australian now, but the sort of Aussie battler, if you know what I mean. There's something that's very sort of just, because people that were immigrants into this country when my mother was, which would have been in the late 40s, early 50s, they had to make it happen for themselves. They were, they had to. That was about actually being people that solved problems and did things and made it happen for themselves. And my mother's got that. She's also got an incredibly philanthropic streak to her. Mum was always arranging, a fair in the village to raise money for the church roof, or she used to run balls at Chawton House to raise money for the church. So she was always doing something that was for someone else, and right from an early age, that's very much been part of my upbringing, and the sort of the concept of, with privilege comes responsibility. I mean, to me, that absolutely, our family motto is Suivons Saint Pierre, which is obviously follow St. Peter, which is actually a very religious, obviously, statement. Obviously St. Peter at the gates of heaven. But to me, if I had to say, what do I actually think it is, in terms of my experience there, certainly with Granny and my mother, it was with privilege comes responsibility. And there was never, there used to be occasionally, and I don't know where these people came from, but occasionally I remember, I'm going to sound really rude. I'm going to say something. I don't know if this is the appropriate term to use nowadays, but what I would have called back then tramps, really sort of dishevelled sort of people that looked like they were sort of homeless. A couple of sort of old tramp men used to turn up, in the summer, and Granny would give them some food and whatever. But she spoke to everybody with the same level of respect, the same level of, she was exactly the same with everybody. And my mother was the same, if you know what I mean. There's absolutely no, and if you have privilege, and we've got no money, that's not the privilege. But we're all incredibly privileged to be born into Western societies and be educated and to have the opportunities that we do. And, I'm obviously incredibly privileged to have the heritage that I've got. I mean, who wouldn't want to be related to Jane Austen? I mean, I wouldn't swap it for anybody, for anything. I wouldn't swap it. And so, as I said, yes, I certainly think that those two qualities of, energy and making things happen and that drive to, as I said, want to, of course, do well for ourselves. Being philanthropic isn't at the expense of yourself. You want to do well for yourself, but it's also important that you're, that you're contributing at the same time.
Yeah, totally get that. And I think that again links to that idea that obviously at the house, it was this centre of community. And I love that particularly a lot of the women in your family, they just took on that role as like the hosts, they were made sure that the community was invited in and that there was these opportunities for them to get together and run occasions, raise money, that kind of thing, which obviously we'll talk about as if you've now continued that yourself. But I'd love to talk about what it was like to leave Chawton, obviously where it got to the point that you had to leave and your family had to move out. In your book, you linked it to what it was like for the Dashwoods leaving their home and Anne Elliot when she had to move out of her home. I think for anybody, moving out of your childhood home is difficult, but particularly, like you said, for Chawton, it having such a deep-rooted place in everybody's heart, like it's part of your DNA. What that was like, you put a quote in your book actually that said that and it was a bit later when you were reflecting back, it said Chawton weighed heavily on my mind, and it made me think about in Rebecca that first line where she says, last night I dreamt of Manderley again. Obviously different connotations, but it's just that that it sticks with you forever. In a way, it almost haunts you, not necessarily always in a negative way, but it has that lasting impression. So I'd love to talk about what it was like to leave, but then also living with leaving your home.
So I always knew that we were going to have to leave. I don't remember not knowing that. I mean, again, so that must have been something that was, when I say talked about, I mean, it wasn't a conversation that I ever would have had with Granny but certainly my parents, in the privacy of our quarters would have, I mean, families don't anyway, but particular family of that culture, money isn't something that anybody talks about, I mean, so that wasn't a conversation, as I said, that the family as a whole were having together. But I knew from my parents that, yes, we had the house and obviously the land it sat on, but other than that, the fortune was gone. I knew that. And I could see with my own eyes that because once you've sold off all the buildings and the land and everything, you start selling the contents. And so it was plain to see by comparing photographs of Chawton House from decades prior to those rooms now, and just realizing what had gone, what we didn't have anymore. But at the same time, it's very difficult at the same time. So I've got that, my parents being very honest with me in that way, but of course reassuring us that it would all be okay. At the same time, we've got visitors, and all these visitors think we're really rich. Why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you? So they all think and say we're really rich. So do people that I go to school with. They have an assumption that we're really rich. So, or certainly the kids do. I mean, the parents might have been able to see that that wasn't quite the case, but certainly the children did. And so those two messages are quite conflicting. It was also quite difficult as a child to comprehend that I can stand here, outside, and I can twist, turn, and every single thing I can see we own, and yet you're telling me we haven't got any money. That those two things don't go together as a kid. You can't square that. So it was something that I always knew, but didn't quite believe. There was always a part of me that thought, no, my grandfather's just eccentric. Do you know what I mean? Somewhere there's got to, somewhere there's going to be a suitcase tucked under a bed somewhere that's going to have, it's going to be full of gold. Surely. And also, I think I believed that because isn't that much easier to believe than what the reality was? That was much easier. Yeah. So I think as a child, I went with that. As the answer. And of course, when it actually happened, I mean, it's like anything. When these things happen, when Bapops died, in one way it was sort of strange because he was someone I had zero relationship with. I didn't know him at all. So the grief, it wasn't actually, to be honest, it wasn't actually that I've lost a grandfather who I'm really close to. That's not what's happening. But I've just lost, of course, to me, he was the king. Do you know what I mean? He was the king, wasn't he, of our of our family in that sort of way. And also I knew that his death meant so much to so many people, just in terms of what was about to happen, the amount of change that was about to happen. His death I knew signaled the end, because obviously, by the time he actually died, I was 17 by then, and I had, through conversation with mum and dad, really understood. I did really understand by the time he died that would be the end of it. So it was sort of hugely significant. Of course it was. And like any sort of thing like that, we all or certainly I do in those moments, I sort of almost go into a slightly dream state, if you know what I mean. You're just getting through it, aren't you? You're just putting one foot in front of the other and doing what you got to do. We left Chawton House actually about a year later. So it wasn't immediate, which was great. My uncle Richard inherited as the eldest son. And was fantastic, and worked, with my parents, and obviously I had other aunts and uncles and cousins that lived there to obviously give everyone, good time to find alternative places to live. And my parents bought a house in Alton. I actually left home before we actually left. I got a live-in nanny job, which, looking back on it now, was simply because I just couldn't bear it. I did not want to be there for the last day. I could not at all, and I didn't. Now, looking back on it, what I actually did was run away and just left everybody else to. I didn't help pack it up. I didn't help do anything, which now I think, oh my goodness, how selfish was that? I really should have been helping, but I just couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. And it absolutely broke my heart, and still does, absolutely. But it's something that, and again, it's not the house, it's the family being together, it's the sense of belonging, it's the, and I just don't think that I had, as I said, because I couldn't quite accept it, because that was just too difficult to think about. I hadn't really in my mind formed any identity that existed outside of Chawton, if you know what I mean. I'm Caroline Jane Knight from Chawton House. That's who I am, and I bake with Granny on a Sunday, and I do this on a. And even if I was growing older, obviously, and getting, first boyfriend and things like that, which of course takes your attention away, doesn't it, as you start to grow up. But those events and things, I never missed the fete, I never missed Snapdragon, I never, those things were still really important. So my reaction to it was to run in the opposite direction. Starting off as a nanny, and I eventually ended up in business. I was absolutely determined that I was going to be successful on my own independently. And I was determined because I didn't ever want to be moved out of my home again when it wasn't my decision, if you know what I mean. It really made me so determined. Also determined that I didn't want to marry a rich guy. I don't want to be beholden to him. Do you know what I mean? I just had a whole thing that I am going to be in control of what happens to me from now on, which in a way made me, too much of a workaholic, too ambitious, there was a while there where I really did sort of, ardently stride off in that direction. But the good thing about it is that absolute drive I had propelled me a very long way forward, and actually, it drove me into a corporate career, and a good one, and certainly professionally I've done very well. And that's been, as I said, that absolutely came from that drive that this isn't happening again. And I'm sure when I started work, I probably had ridiculous sort of thoughts of, and I'm going to make millions and buy it back. I've given that up a long time ago. Now I realise what's involved in a house like that. I don't want to, if you know what I mean.
I'll keep my millions. I'll make them and keep them.
Exactly. I really get it, and I really do get it. It's a constant expense and struggle to kind of keep a house like that going. Even today, it is.
Even a smaller version, like the house I grew up in was like a converted like stable house. I'm not converted that well, but like we used to come downstairs and the mop was frozen in the kitchen, like in the thing it was frozen because the house was that cold. Because it's impossible to keep houses even on a small.
We had heating on a couple of months a year, exactly, because of the cost.
Yeah, it's impossible to keep houses that are that old. Yeah, it really is. It takes so much money. So yeah, I totally get what you're saying, this idea of feeling like you're kind of running away. Do you think that kind of fed into how you kind of ran away from, because like for I know for a while you really didn't talk about the fact that you were like where you'd come from, like how your family was linking to Jane Austen, and your book, something that stood out to me is when everybody started watching the 1995 Pride and Prejudice, and how you obviously had a connection to it, but you didn't really want people to know that, and you didn't even really want to watch it in the first place.
Nobody. So I didn't. I mean, of course, people I grew up with, of course, know who I am, and you always knew who I am. Of course I did. But because I moved away from the area, I then didn't tell anybody. For 25 years, I didn't tell anybody what my background was, or about the house, or that I had a connection to Jane Austen. And as you quite rightly say, so 1995. So at this point, Chawton House wasn't open yet as a public building. So in those days, people actually didn't know Chawton. It'd been a private home. Why would anybody know it? It was never advertised on the internet. The internet didn't exist. I mean, it was a private home. But of course, now it's known all over the world, but it wasn't back then. But as you said, so I was at university. Yes, and all the girls were going on about this new thing. And yes. And I never said a word. Never said a word. For me at the time, because I literally, my heart broke. And my way of dealing with that was to, right, let's pop that off, in a box somewhere else, and I'm going in the opposite direction to do something else. I in no way, processed it, or whatever the, terms are to use, if you know what I mean. I in no way actually got over it at all. I just ignored it. So I didn't want to talk about it, because all it was to me was just loss and pain, and just something I didn't want to talk about. And I also think that it was a very difficult loss to talk about then, because I always had this sense of, if I actually tell people about this, they're going to see I'm upset. How do I explain that? and actually saying to somebody the fact that I had to effectively, where I had to move house when I was 18. If I, that, you know, it felt like, well, lots of people have to move house. Do you know what I mean? It felt like such a silly little thing to have been so catastrophic to me at the time. And I also used to have this sense of that I'm saying, we've lost our castle. And I'm really, it came across like, or I used to be worried that I'd just come across like a spoilt brat, if you know what I mean, who was sucking because I've lost my big bedroom, you know, and
Yeah,
so I didn't, because everyone else I knew was not, we didn't have any money. I wasn't interacting with rich people in my life. I haven't spent my life with people that you think live in houses like that. I haven't. I've spent my life with completely ordinary people. How on earth do I have that conversation with somebody? How do I do that and not come, and how, you know, so I just never had this. So it was just easier not to. But then in 2013, it all changed with the 200-year anniversary of Pride and Prejudice. And by then I'd been in Australia. So I moved here in 2008. And one of the things I absolutely loved about Australia was there was no references to Jane Austen here. And there's a lot of Jane Austen readers here, but in, 15 years ago, whenever that was, 16 years ago, Jane Austen wasn't particularly part of popular culture here. That explosion hadn't yet happened here. It had in other countries, but not here yet. But then in 2013, which was 25 years after we left, it was the 200-year anniversary of Pride and Prejudice. And because of that, in that sort of February, March of that year, all of a sudden, everywhere I looked, there was a reference to Jane Austen. The Jane Austen tea room opened. It's about 8 kilometres away from my house where I'm sitting right now. There's a Jane Austen tea room. There's nothing to do with me. I mean, obviously I'm friends with them and I do events there and things, but that's opened completely independently of me. All of the cultural centres and things and the state library, everywhere was doing something Jane Austen sort of orientated. There were documentaries on TV. There were re-showings of Pride and Prejudice, obviously, and it just sort of felt, this place where actually I can forget about all of that is changing, and that's not what it's going to be anymore. And I just had this real sense of, it's now. The time has come that I need to deal with this. I can't run away anymore. I'm 43 at that point. I can't run away from this anymore. I've got to deal with this emotionally. I've got to get over this. I've got to be able to deal with this. And also, and I'm somebody that by character, I know the best way to get the best out of myself is to back myself into a corner. If you understand what I mean by that. So I knew that if I stood on the sidelines, sort of thinking, oh, well, maybe I'll go and visit Chawton once and see how that feels. And maybe I knew that if I kind of just stood on the sidelines, I would faff about for years. Do you know what I mean? Trying to do it and running away again and then trying to do it. So for me personally, I thought, right, I've got to do something which is going to mean I have to get used to this. That's what I sort of mean. I'm going to put myself in a position where I have to figure this out. And just the business woman in me thought, Jane, obviously that 2013 anniversary just brought into such sharp focus how popular Jane is today. And because I'd been avoiding her for 25 years, I hadn't been avoiding her. It's obviously, I'm incredibly proud of Jane. It's nothing to do with her. But because I was avoiding any memories of it, I actually didn't realise that she had transformed from this incredibly popular but basically, the people that used to come to Chawton when I lived there, they were readers of classical literature. Well, that's not the case. Now, yes, some of them are. But you've also got masses of people who obviously enjoy Austen through film and movie and societies and theatre. And there's so many, So now, as I said, it's become so huge. And I just thought at that point, there's an opportunity there. There's an opportunity to if there are these tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people that are that, passionate about Jane and her work and consider her, almost in their friends circle, you know, is Jane Austen. You know, she's somebody that they, you know, is really special to them. And I just thought, well, there's an opportunity in there. There's an opportunity in there to do something for good, I suppose, is when my thoughts started. I have no experience in literacy. I'm not a teacher. I'm not qualified in literacy at all. But I, as it happens, I've been on the board of charities for, let's just say 15 years. And even though I actually never realised I was doing it, they're all educational. Every charity I've been on has always been about education. And that was never a conscious decision, but they have. And I just thought, you know, Jane Austen's got to be literacy, hasn't it? I mean, it was just a no-brainer. I mean, I didn't write a list and pick literacy. It's the Jane Austen Literacy Foundation. And it was sort of, you know, the moment of thought to, do I want to get involved in this? To, okay, I've got to do something, as I said. The only way I'm going to get over this is almost by, as I said, facing that fear really head on, step right in the middle of it. Jane Austen Literacy Foundation, that's what I'm doing. And I'm now going to give up my CEO job that I've had, that I'm doing really well at, so I can do this foundation. That happened in probably 15 minutes. And it was something that, but then I found, as soon as I'd had the idea, and I thought, you know, I with the combination of my heritage and the business skills I've got, you know, and of course this worldwide passion for Jane Austen, mixed in there is an organisation that can do a lot of good. And I actually, and I realise that I'm actually the only person that has the combination of those things who's here wanting to do it. So if I don't do it, it's not going to happen, is it? And it was like this idea that I couldn't unhave it. Do you know what I mean? I couldn't unhave the idea. There was no going backwards from there. There was just no going back.
It sounds like the universe agreed, and the universe was always pushing you to it as well. Especially in the end, it was like, hello, we've been trying to push you.
Exactly. And it's one of these things exactly that and you do, those things do happen in life where you think, actually, you know, when I look back, it looks like all roads have been leading to here, which I had no idea about. I didn't know that at all. But absolutely, all things just, and there was just a moment. And that happens in life, doesn't it? Just these pivotal moments where things just change. And so I did resign from a CEO role. At that point, I was CEO of a big marketing agency here. So I resigned from that job and set up a sort of, I actually work professionally in FMCG retail, which is supermarkets, you know, yeah, the retail industry. So I'm a sort of marketing and consultant and business leader in that space. So I set up a small business so I could actually work part-time. So I've been consulting to businesses for the last, consulting and coaching for 12 years now. But that's because that's enabled me to work part-time. Because the foundation is a completely volunteer organisation. So I'm a volunteer as well. So, you know, it's been something that I've probably given, you know, 2 or 3 days a week for 10 years too. But I obviously still have to work to pay my bills.
Yes, a labour of love.
Well,
like what I consider the podcast.
It really is. It really is a labour of love. It's also something that, as I said, it's a great opportunity. It's also, of course, all of us love doing something that we think makes a difference and also is our legacy as well, if you know what I mean. You know, of course, I want to do something. And if the Jane Austen Literacy Foundation is what I contributed, then I'm good with that. You know, that'll, you know.
Yeah. I think that's very much true of your whole family. I think not for everyone, but for the Knights in particular, lineage and legacy seem to intertwine. That's not always the case. I think people think it is, but it isn't. But I think for your family, that has been the case. And I love that you went and you've now started the foundation, because I think that just, with it being literacy and Jane Austen and everything, yeah, I think definitely is what you were meant to do in many ways.
It was. Now, in fairness, I mean, I think that, of course, this has been driven, in fairness, more by the worldwide Jane Austen community, who made Jane into this phenomenal success. I mean, one of the things I've always been interested, always, even as a child, as I said, I'm actually more connected. I mean, obviously, I've read all of Jane's work, and I think, I mean, of course, I recognise the utter genius of her writing, and I could talk for a day about how incredible I think her writing is, and you know, she is incredible. Because I think because I'm not a writer, but I am a businesswoman. I mean, I am somebody that I spend my life talking to people and trying to help people. You know, make the most of their potential, tap into themselves and reach their dreams and achieve what they want to. And because I do that, and that's something that I've, you know, as a child, I was always fascinated with what are all of these people here for? You know, as an audience, why do they come? What are they looking for? Why are they here? What was it about Jane that made her successful? Because yes, talent is of course incredibly important, and her talent is beyond question. But it does actually take more than talent to be successful. You know, you've actually got to have a plan, haven't you? You've got to have, you know, and there's lots of things Jane did that were, you know, that fit in very much to how we coach people nowadays, and the things and the qualities we talk about that are, you know, that are important in, you know, in people. And it's very much, as I said, it's Jane, the woman, if you like, that has been my inspiration very much, you know, in life.
Yeah, I think the whole community can agree with that. I think she's almost this mass facilitator where we all find this space where we can belong, you know. And I personally, I mean, I'm obviously in the Austen community, but I struggle to find another author who's had such a massive reach in that sense that, you know, all these years later, she's got such an there isn't one. She's got this giant community. Yeah,
Absolutely.
exactly. And
I mean, of course, you've got
yeah,
other
they were
authors
also
like
passionate
Shakespeare,
about.
which are equally respected, of course, and you know, but in terms of the volume of activity today, for a classic writer, she's absolutely unrivaled. Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah, it's pretty incredible. If you don't mind chatting a little bit about the main focus of the foundation, the work that you're doing, I think that'd be really good for everybody to hear, and also ways that you're, you know, raising money and what's next in your calendar for the foundation.
So the Jane Austen Literacy Foundation, we do a few things. Our mission, if you like, is to connect through literacy. And that sort of manifests itself in a few different ways. So one of the things we do, and we run entirely by volunteers, and there'd be hundreds of people involved across the world. But what we do is a few things. So one of the things is we run a calendar every year of different literacy activities online that engage our community. So we do a global writing competition, which actually closed yesterday. So we're waiting to see who the winner of this year's winner is. But we do a global writing competition every year, and the winner of the 3 winning short stories are actually recorded as an audiobook by Alison Larkin, who is the top-selling Austen narrator, and published worldwide. So that's a great prize. We run a 30-day literacy challenge in September. You know, we do lots of things like that, as I said, are great ways of connecting our community and very much, you know, in literacy activities. We also raise money, as you said, and we raise money for literacy programs in developing communities, and we raise money in all sorts of ways. You know, we've got a book plate shop online. You can buy, you know, a book plate personalised with your name in Jane Austen's handwriting. We do events. We are literally launching this week, which will be Wednesday, a Tea for Literacy campaign. So for 2 months, we're asking people to be a host, you know, throughout May and June, be a host of Tea for Literacy and be a fundraiser for the Jane Austen Literacy Foundation. And you can get online and you download a free pack that's got everything you could need in it. And you have a fun afternoon tea, you know, and it's got some Jane Austen games and things in there that you can play. So we have lots of different mechanics, if you like, for raising money, as you'd expect. But as I said, and all of that money is spent on literacy programs in developing communities. We also, because one of the things that's really magic about the Jane Austen community, a couple of things. One, most people are highly literate. They're either avid, you know, they're either, you know, people that read a lot, they're teachers, they're writers. That is the general, if you like, Jane Austen community. And also, the Jane Austen community are, in general, very generous people. You know, they're people that are have a good spirit. They're people that, or certainly the people that come forward, they want to be part of something. Obviously they want to be part of something with Jane Austen's name on it. So we're very lucky, actually, as an organisation. It is actually one of the unique powers that we have, if you like, is the ability to draw really good quality volunteers who are happy to, obviously share their literacy skills. So with that, we do a couple of things. We do things like we create resources for schools, for teachers and things. So our volunteers will put together things that teachers can just download and do, different literacy activities that they can easily use in the classroom, that sort of thing, and a whole load of other things. But that's resources for schools. And we also do, which we're actually pivoting the program at the moment, but we actually do something called a literacy mentor program. And that's where people can, again, they give a couple of hours a month of their time, and they might be mentoring somebody who needs some, help with literacy. They might be, but they'll actually be giving their time directly. They might be reading children's work and sort of giving some constructive feedback on it, but basically it's using their own time and their own literacy skills to benefit, obviously, other people that need it. And I have to say, when I started the organisation, I imagined that fundraising was going to be the key focus, and it is still a big focus of what we do. But as I got to know and work with the Jane Austen community across the world so much, as I said, the fact that the volunteer base that we have, and how generous the community is and how happy people are to share their literacy with other people, that has actually grown into a much bigger part of the organisation than I realised at the beginning it was going to. So we're looking in the future at future programmes of things like, can we, in places like India, and we fund some programs in India, in some of those sort of most impoverished regions, if you like, some of the teachers that work there, their own education isn't to the quality or standard that a Western teacher, for want of a better expression, would have. So we're looking at things like, well, how do we create a mentor program, so that, a teacher perhaps who's, got a high level of qualification in America, say, can they do a once monthly mentor session with a teacher in India and just try and, give them some tips and some help on how to improve literacy in the classroom, those sorts of things. So we're constantly looking at ways to, as I said, use the volunteer resources to the best and really see how we can apply those best to the literacy mission. And of course, how we're going to increase the fundraising. 2025 is coming up. Next year is a big year for us, big year for the entire Jane Austen community. Obviously, it's the 250-year anniversary of Jane's birth, which is going to be a big deal. And for a period of time, Jane Austen will be mainstream. That's a historic event that, of course, I would think that every media outlet's at least going to want to mention it, aren't they? And there's going to be, again, a whole load of activity. Every cultural centre and library and, all of those places are going to be having some sort of Jane Austen event. So like an awful lot of organisations that work in the Jane Austen arena, we're very much getting ready for 2025. I'm planning to visit America and do some events in America. And we're actually launching the Jane Austen Literacy Foundation America, in America. It's launching, as a registered charity in America in 25. That'll happen. So all eyes are there. My next trip, immediately what's next is in June. Every June I go back to Chawton for Jane Austen Regency Week, of which I'm patron of Jane Austen Regency Week, and I host a couple of events there. So one, we do a parade for literacy to raise money for the foundation, and the other that we do is a Regency picnic that we do in the grounds of Chawton House, which I'm host of and always organise. But this year I'm actually going a week early this year, because I have been invited. There's a big event going on at a big venue called G Live in Guildford, and there's an event there called the Sanditon Celebration. So that is a celebration of all things Sanditon over a couple of days, and there's going to be actors and cast, crew and writers and things there, and lots of different speakers and things. And I'm actually speaking there on the Saturday, and then I've actually been asked to co-host. There's a Sanditon Awards on the Saturday night, which is the 15th of June, and I've been asked to co-host that. So that'll be very nice, handing out some awards. So as I said, over a little bit earlier this year, but that's that's my next plan.
And I'll add all the information that Caroline's mentioned below as well, so everybody can find, obviously, the foundation, the Sanditon event, all of that kind of thing will be in the bio as always. Another thing that I want to ask you before we wrap up is, what was your experience like reading Jane Austen for the first time? What was it like coming back to it later in life? And, you know, just in general, like your experience reading Austen. I can imagine it's slightly different than what everyone else experiences because you have such a connection.
I think that... So I wasn't, and so growing up at Chawton House, as I said, because I was a kid that wanted to be so involved in everything, you know, and I wanted to be cooking and getting ready for things or helping Dad in the garden and again, because we had the property, but we didn't have the staff to go with it. Everybody was busy. You know, every weekend my father would be, you know, out with a chainsaw clearing a broken tree, or, you know, my parents had a big vegetable garden in the walled garden at Chawton House. You know, there was always, everyone was busy. So I joined in with that. So I was actually, as a child, not a hugely avid reader, if you know what I mean. I wasn't a bookworm of a child. I did try reading Pride and Prejudice, I'm gonna say at 8 or 9, that sort of age, and to be quite honest, it was too much for me, if you know what I mean. The you know, it wasn't something that I could understand enough to read, so I didn't. I then came back to it, however, when I was about 14, 15, and that was a time at which the inevitable end of Chawton House was not on my mind, but was, you know, it was coming, and we, you know, we didn't know when, but we knew it was going to come at some point. And the fact that it really was the end, you know, was sinking in. And when I read Pride and Prejudice, all the bit that I was interested in was Mr. Collins and that entail and Mrs. Bennet, because that Chawton House was entailed to my father's eldest brother, Richard, older brother, the only older brother, Richard. So Chawton House is under an entail. So that's the same thing, isn't it, as what's going on in this book? You know, when the patriarch dies, you know, everyone's going to have to leave the house because somebody else is going to inherit it. Now, Richard is no Mr. Collins. I mean, don't get me wrong. Richard's an absolute gentleman. I've got, you know, he's an absolutely lovely, lovely man. But he didn't live there. So as a child, he was a visitor, you know, a visitor who's going to inherit our house. And when he does, we're going to have to leave. And as I said, Richard's absolutely lovely. He never made us feel awkward about that. There was never, you know, that he's a lovely man. But that still was the situation. So when I first read Pride and Prejudice, that's what I was homing in on. And I know everyone else talked about Lizzie and Darcy, but that's not what I was concentrating on at all. And I used to, when I first published Jane and Me in 2017, and I was doing a lot of interviews and things at that stage, journalists, it was quite a common question of which Bennet sister are you? For some reason that used to, you know, I used to get asked that, exactly, which Bennet sister are you? And I always used to say, I'm none of them, I'm Mrs. Bennet. I relate to that woman, and I actually sometimes get quite cross at how Hollywood has turned her into such a ridiculous character, because I know that she was written with a lot of wit around, you know, the writing, and so she, and isn't it wonderful that she was, and that's great. But she wasn't written quite as ridiculously as some of the movie makers would make her, and actually, arguably, she was the only sane one of the lot of them, if you know what I mean. She was the only one that really got and seemed to be taking seriously what was going on in a way that I could relate to. You know, because to me, that was the worry. What is going to happen? What is going to happen?
Yeah.
You know, I couldn't imagine living anywhere else. I had no, you know, and it was, I mean, when I say it was scary, I mean, it's, you know, like, you know, these things go on in the background, don't they? It's not as though, you know, it was actually actively worrying me every day, but it was there. It was a conscious, you know, it was a conscious concern. So yes, it took a long time. I then read Sense and Sensibility, and as I was younger, and I had read all of them, say by the time I was 20. But in all of them, to be quite honest, at that time, that's all I was looking at. I wasn't reading them at all as objective novels. I couldn't see them in that way at all, because my naive mind, which sounds ridiculous now. I mean, I was 15 when I read, as I said, Pride and Prejudice, but my naive mind honestly went, how did she know? That's what I thought. My first thought was, how did she know that that's the predicament we were going to be in, and that's what she's written about? And in truth, of course, she didn't know. It's just a very common story. But I didn't know that. I had no, other than what was going on with us and what was written in Pride and Prejudice, those were the only two references I had to what happens to big house, or what happens to properties when they're entailed, and this inheritance thing. As I said, because we weren't socializing with other people that owned massive houses like that. That wasn't part of because we didn't have the money to be moving in those circles. And then it was only, as I said, as I've come back to Jane Austen, so in 2013. And of course, I have to say, for a couple of years, I consumed every movie I could. I played catch up. And of course, I've read all of her books multiple times in completely different eyes. And for the first time, actually. So I was probably in my 40s. I was definitely in my 40s the first time I actually read Jane Austen, I think, in the way that other people do. Of course, I knew she was really good because everybody else said she was. And all the fans and all the people coming and all this. So, and if all these people say, and everyone says she's brilliant, but I didn't, in terms of her work, I didn't get that, till I was in my 40s. As a youngster, I got how incredible she was. But that's probably also because that's what my mum used to tell me about. And I knew, because we used to go to the village shop, which is where Cassandra's Cup Tea Room is now. So that's opposite Jane Austen's house. And we'd go down there, I don't know, a couple of times a week after school. For some reason, we'd have to, stop into the shop. And so you'd see all these people coming in and out of Jane Austen's house. And I used to ask Mum, what are they doing? I could never understand why people were coming from all over the world to look at, I'm going to say something really crass here, and I don't mean it like this, but look at the 200-year-old stuff of a dead person. You know what I mean? As a 5-year-old, that's what it is. Do you know what I mean? It's what are all these people doing? I just couldn't. I really couldn't get that. But Mum used to explain to me, and what she used to tell me about, as I said, was the fact that Jane had completely defied all expectations of society, how brave she was, her refusing Harris Bigwithers, which we used to laugh about, Jane Bigwithers, that used to be a funny sort of, so that was the Jane, as I said, that I grew up with. I didn't really get to appreciate her literature until 10 years ago.
Wow.
And people often say, well, one of the things that sometimes happens at events, when I do events, is, this has happened on a few of them, people seem, I think, sometimes actually quite disappointed when they learn that as a family living in Chawton, we weren't sitting around the fire on a Sunday afternoon reading Jane Austen out loud. That's the kind of impression they have. And we weren't. And I think we weren't for a few reasons. I think we weren't because, I think it's like, this may be a bad example, but I don't think Brad Pitt's kids necessarily would be watching all of his movies the same as other people do. I mean, it is a different kind of thing when it's part of your family. But also, I grew up in a household where my father and my brother are dyslexic. And dyslexia didn't exist back then, if you know what I mean. In the 70s and 80s, it was a very new word. It certainly wasn't something that is well known as it is now. So when I was young, in practice, my father's reading was very poor and his writing was very poor. And it was something that my brother, had difficulties with as well. And when you live in a household with people that can't read and write very well, you don't spend your time talking about books and reading and writing. Because somehow that's, you know what I mean? That it's not you just don't, do you? You wouldn't be sitting around the table as a family talking about something that
pointing out people's insecurities.
Why are you doing that? So in practice, we were actually, we were probably a lot less bookish than people would imagine we were. And as I said, that was driven by that, which is probably also another reason why I'm not, and thankfully I'm very fortunate I'm not dyslexic, and I have no literacy difficulties. But I think probably the fact that I grew up in a household that did is probably another reason why the Jane Austen Literacy Foundation. Of course, that's what I'm going to do. Of course, that's what I'm going to do. Yeah. Because as I said, it's not my issue, but it is something that I grew up with. I have some understanding of what that does. Yes.
Yeah. Definitely. Oh, well, this has been so amazing. Thank you so much for coming on. Honestly, fabulous. It was amazing reading your book, and I will link that below as well. But also getting the chance to speak to you has been so wonderful.
Pleasure.
So thank you so much.
Pleasure. Anytime.
That is everything from us today, and I will see you in another episode.